The survey drone came back with 47 minutes of rock formations, atmospheric dust counts, and one thing that did not belong. Reed Calloway was at his desk when it returned. He was writing a report on fungal growth patterns in the soil near the old mining corridor. It was exactly as unexciting as it sounds, and he was exactly the kind of person who did not mind. He had asked for this posting. Quiet, remote, far from everything and everyone. Research Outpost Duvin 9 sat at the edge of known Concord space, maintained by 11 crew members and visited by nobody who did not have to be there. Reed had been there 6 months and had never once wished he was somewhere else. Then he saw the thermal reading. Reed stared at the reading for a while. It did not explain itself. He looked at the coordinates, looked at the timestamp, looked at the reading again. Then he put on his coat and went to the crawler bay. Commander Dale Oren found him loading a field kit. Oren was the kind of man who read the regulations carefully and believed in them sincerely. He was not a bad person. He was the kind of person who felt safest when the rules were being followed, and who got genuinely anxious when they were not. He asked Reed where he was going. Reed told him. He said there was a thermal anomaly in the wreck, and he was going to check it. Oren said it was probably equipment malfunction. The old hauler was full of systems that failed in strange ways after this many years. Reed said probably. Oren watched him load the kit for a moment, and then asked what else it could be. The crawler ride took 40 minutes across hard ground. The sun on this side of the sector gave light, but no warmth, and the corridor was wide and gray and filled with the silence of places that used to be busy and were not anymore. Reed drove without music. He was comfortable with quiet in a way that many people were not. Reed parked the crawler and went in on foot with a handlight. He found it in a hollow between 2 fallen support structures, half buried in the cooled slag of an engine that had stopped working long ago. The egg was the color of dark stone. It was cracked, not broken open but damaged from the outside, from an impact that had happened a long time ago. The shell was thick and dense, but the crack had spread from the point of impact in fine lines like a spiderweb caught in place. It was warm. Faintly, impossibly, still warm. Reed crouched down and held his hand near it without touching. He could feel the heat from several centimeters away. He knew what it was. He was a xenobiologist, and he had spent 3 years studying the biological records of every major species in the galactic Concord. He knew what a Dree egg looked like. He knew what it needed. He knew exactly what it meant under Concord law to touch it. He stood there in the dark of the dead wreck and thought about all of those things for a long moment. Then he took off his jacket, wrapped the egg in it carefully, and held it against his chest. When he came through the station door, Oren was there. He looked at what Reed was carrying. He went quiet for a moment that stretched. Then he asked how bad it was. Reed set the egg gently on the nearest flat surface and told Oren everything. The location, the age of the wreck against the clear recency of the egg, the damage to the shell, the warmth that was still there but fading, whatever had sustained it inside the hauler, nearly gone now. Oren said they had to report it immediately. A Dree egg was sovereign property of the Dree Empire under 4 separate Concord agreements. There was no ambiguity about this. Reed said he knew. Oren said if they reported it now, the response would be clean, orderly. Someone would come, and it would be handled properly through the right channels. Reed said, and in the meantime? Oren stopped. He looked at the egg. The crack was visible from where he stood, running through the shell in thin, dark lines. Oren stood there for a while. Then he said, 72 hours. And if anything changed, Reed would tell him immediately. Reed agreed. He picked the egg up and carried it to the lab. Reed set up the thermal support unit, placed the egg inside, and calibrated the temperature to what he knew a Dree egg required. Then he sat down on the floor next to it and waited. The egg cracked open 11 hours later, just before the station lights shifted to morning cycle. What came out was barely the size of 2 cupped hands. The scales were gray-violet and dull, the eyes still fully sealed. It made a sound when it emerged that stopped Reed completely. Not a roar. Not anything dangerous or dramatic. It was small and searching and very young. The sound of something that had just arrived in a place it did not understand and wanted to know if anyone was there. Reed reached in and lifted it carefully and held it against his chest. He did not sleep at all. Rin was the size of a house cat for exactly 11 days. Then he was not. Reed had read everything available on Dree hatchling development in those first days. The Concord Xenobiology database had limited material because the Dree did not share information about their young with other species. What Reed had was enough to understand the basics. Dree hatchlings grew fast in the first months of life, needed elevated temperatures to regulate their body systems, and were deeply sensitive to the emotional state of whoever was near them. Their nervous systems were wired to pick up on calm and on fear with equal clarity. The station's food inventory began declining in ways the automated system logged as irregular. Commander Orrin noticed. He chose not to say anything, which Reed understood as a form of quiet agreement. Rin grew. In the first 2 weeks, he doubled in size. By the end of the first month, he was too large to be carried comfortably. By the second month, he was the size of a medium animal, long-limbed and heavy-tailed, with a wingspan that was still too small to be functional, but more than large enough to clear objects off shelves when he stretched. The station adapted around him, or tried to. Technician Russ, who was 22 and had spent his career on postings that did not involve large fauna, encountered Rin in the corridor on the first morning after the hatchling had grown large enough to move freely. Russ pressed himself against the wall and went completely still. Rin approached, sniffed him carefully, and walked away. Russ appeared to find this simultaneously insulting and deeply relieving. Over the following weeks, he watched Rin from a safe distance with the expression of someone who had not decided yet whether this was interesting or terrifying, and was leaning toward both. Dr. Alya Finn, the station xenochemist, told Reed on 4 separate occasions that the hatchling was a regulatory problem, a liability, and that she had not agreed when she signed her contract to share living space with a fire-capable juvenile predator. She also spent most of her evenings writing extremely detailed biological observational notes on Rin's development. She did not share these notes with anyone. Reed knew because the station walls were thin and he could hear her dictating quietly to herself when the corridors were empty. The combustion episodes began in Rin's 6th week. His fire glands were developing, and in young Dree, they misfired frequently before the biological control systems finished forming. The first episode happened without warning in the main corridor. Technician Russ screamed. The sound startled Rin, which triggered a second combustion immediately. There was smoke, a smell that took 2 days to clear, and a research terminal that did not survive. There were 3 small fires over the following weeks. Nobody was seriously hurt. Orrin filed damage reports that described the cause as electrical faults with a creativity that Reed quietly appreciated. The episode lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, Rin went limp and slept against Reed for 6 hours. Reed had burns on both forearms. He did not report them or mention them. Alya discovered them 3 days later when she noticed him favoring his arms during a routine equipment check and pushed up his sleeve without asking. She brought him to the medical bay in silence and treated the burns without a word. Then she asked why he had not come in immediately. Reed said he had not wanted Rin to see him flinch. Alya was quiet for a long moment. Then she went back to her lab and closed the door behind her. The first word arrived in the 3rd month. Rin had been developing sounds for weeks, a full vocabulary of clicks and low rumbles and sharp calls that Reed had begun to understand the way a person learns any language they live close to for long enough. He had also been trying to shape sounds he heard around him, particularly from Reed, whose voice he tracked constantly. What came out, on a regular afternoon while Reed was preparing food, was small and clear and unmistakable. Duh. Reed set down what he was holding. He sat down on the floor right there in the middle of the room. He said, "Yeah, okay." Over the weeks that followed, Rin's language developed further. He was picking up pieces of both standard and what appeared to be instinctive Dree infant speech, mixing them in ways that were hard to categorize. The word he used most consistently, the one he produced when he was hungry or frightened or simply wanted Reed clothes, was longer and more structured than the others. It had the shape of Dree language, though Rin had never heard Dree spoken directly. Hale Suveth heard Rin use it for the first time one evening in the corridor and went very still. Reed asked her what it meant. She chose her words carefully. In Dree developmental language, she said, there were multiple words for different kinds of parental bonds. They were specific and they were not interchangeable. The word Rin was using was one of the oldest of them. It meant father who stays. Reed absorbed this quietly. He asked what it meant for Rin going forward, long term. Reed went back to Rin's room and sat with him for a long time without saying much. Rin climbed into his lap, which was becoming physically complicated given the ongoing size difference. Reed did not stop him. He let him try anyway, and stayed where he was until Rin's breathing slowed. A week later, a Concord communications packet arrived during the overnight shift. It contained a low-priority inquiry, a standard follow-up from a Dree trade vessel that had reported a lost egg near the Duvin 9 sector several months prior. The inquiry did not ask specific questions. It was bureaucratic and routine. But it was not nothing. Reed read it once. He set it aside and went to check on Rin. The clock that had been running quietly in the background of all of this had become, suddenly, audible. In the Dree Imperial Court, silence meant one of two things. Either the Queen was thinking, or someone had brought her news she did not want. When Vreth walked through the side entrance with a data tablet, and the room went quiet, every person in that hall knew which kind it was. Vreth had served her for 900 years. He had learned to read the back of her head, which was more useful than it sounded. He crossed the floor without being called and held the tablet where she could take it without turning around. She took it. She read it once. The report was short. A Dree Customs Patrol vessel had completed a standard corridor sweep near the border of Empire space and detected something on a Concord research outpost designated Duvin 9. A biological signature, Dree in origin, coming from inside a human station. Nara set the tablet on the window ledge. She asked 2 questions. She asked if the hatchling was alive. Vreth said yes. She asked if it was inside a human station. He said yes. She dismissed the court with 1 word and walked out. In the war room with the door closed, she did not raise her voice. She never needed to. She said she wanted her fastest ship prepared. She said she would go herself. Vreth had been with her long enough to know that when she said she would go herself, there was no version of the conversation that ended differently. He began the preparations. She intended to find out exactly which detail and to correct it herself. Back at Duvin 9, the signal arrived without any warning at the start of the station's second shift. Priority level. Dree Imperial vessel requesting immediate docking access. The message came through on the main communication system, and every crew member on shift heard it at exactly the same moment. Reed was in Rin's room. Reed was sitting on the floor reading aloud from a geological survey report on the sector's mineral deposits, because Rin found the steady cadence of his voice useful for settling, and it was the only thing reliably working this week. Rin was nearly asleep, one amber eye half open, his long tail curled loosely around the edge of his sleep platform. Orin knocked and came in. He looked at Rin for a moment. Then he looked at Reed and said, "The Dree Queen is coming. They have 14 hours. Reed set the report down in his lap. He looked at Rin. He looked at the tail curled around the platform, the half-open eye, the way the indigo scales caught the light along the ridge of his spine. He looked at all of it for a quiet moment. Then he said, "All right." Orin stood in the doorway. He said there were options still. If they contacted the Concord diplomatic office right now, they might be able to get a mediating body in place before Nara arrived. There were protocols for situations like this. Not exactly like this, but close enough that something could be arranged. Reed said that would take longer than 14 hours, and it would tell the Queen they were frightened, which would not help anything. Orin said that he was frightened. Reed said he knew. He said, "Give me tonight." He was not writing a defense. He was not building an argument. He was writing what anyone who took care of Rin after him would need to know. Hale found him at it near 2 in the morning and sat across from him without asking. She had a cup of something warm, and she did not offer to share it, and he did not ask. They sat without speaking for a while. Eventually, she asked him what she should tell the Queen if she got the chance to speak to her. What did he want her to say? Reed thought about it for a long moment. He said, "Tell her Rin does not like to eat alone. Make sure she knows that." Hale looked at him for a moment that went on longer than usual. Then she stood up and went back down the corridor, and Reed heard her door close. He kept writing until it was finished. When the Dree warship came into visual range, it appeared in the observation window like a second moon, slow and certain. It was enormous in the way that ancient things built by powerful civilizations were enormous. Not designed to impress, just built to last, and the size was simply what lasting looked like at that scale. Its hull carried the marks of centuries, and it moved with the unhurried confidence of something that had never once needed to rush. He made the sound he always made when he wanted Reed to stay close. He did not move from the window. He stayed. For months of waiting ended the moment the docking clamps caught. The sound moved through the station walls like a deep note played on an instrument no one had built for music, felt more than heard, and every person in Duven 9 stopped what they were doing when it reached them. She walked the length of the corridor slowly and looked at each face as she passed. Not aggressively. Precisely. She was reading them the way someone reads a document, taking in what was there without reacting to it yet. She stopped when she reached the end. Reed was standing at the corridor's far end. He was standing there because that was where he stood when Rin was unsettled in his room, close enough to hear through the door. Rin had been picking up on Reed's tension for hours and had been restless and loud about it, and Reed's being close to the door was the only thing that had kept things quiet. He was not standing there to face the queen. He was standing there because it was where he needed to be. Nara looked at him for a moment. She asked, in Galactic Standard, which she did not have to use, and which was a form of precision rather than courtesy, who he was. He told her his name, his role. He did not add anything to it. She said she wanted to see the hatchling. Nara stepped inside and stopped. Reed watched her from the doorway. Everything in the room had been thought about by someone who was thinking specifically about Rin. Nara stood in the center of the room and looked at all of this without speaking. Rin was in the far corner. He was large now, the size of a heavy animal, his indigo scales bright along his back and gold along the spine ridge. His amber eyes were fixed on the new arrival. He had never been in the same room as another Dree before. In Dree biology, young encountering an adult Dree for the first time respond in a specific way. They lower themselves. They go still. They wait to be acknowledged before moving or speaking. It is not a learned behavior. It is older than learning, wired into the earliest layers of their development. Every Dree hatchling in recorded history had done it. Rin looked at Queen Nara. He looked at her for approximately 3 seconds. Then he turned around, walked across the room, and pressed himself against Reed's leg. Nara looked at Rin. She looked at Reed. Then she began to question him. She asked how he found the egg. He told her. She asked why he took it. He said, it was alive and it needed help, and I was there. He did not add anything. He did not qualify it or frame it differently. That was what had happened, and that was what he said. She asked about the combustion episode she had been briefed on. He described it. The duration, the sounds Rin made, what he had done to manage it, how long it lasted. He said it without emphasis, as something that had happened and been dealt with. She asked to see the records. He gave her the document he had written the night before. She read it where she stood. No one moved or spoke while she read. It took a long time. Vreth watched her face. He could read it the way he read the back of her head, and what he read was something he had not seen in many years. When she finished, she was quiet. Then she asked one more question. She asked what Reed wanted from this, what he had expected to gain. Reed looked at Rin. Rin had fallen asleep against Reed's leg at some point in the last few minutes of conversation. He had done this without ceremony, without warning, because Reed's presence was always sufficient for him regardless of what else was happening in the room, and he had been awake and tense for a long time. He was asleep now, his weight leaning fully against Reed's leg, his breathing slow. Reed said, he needed someone. I was there. That is the whole thing. Nara looked at Reed for a long time without speaking. Then she looked at Rin, at the weight of him against Reed's leg, at the way Rin's breathing had gone even and slow in the presence of a human, while the queen of his entire species stood 6 feet away. Then she looked at her own hands. It was brief, a small, private gesture. Only Vreth had served her long enough to know what it meant, and he looked away the moment he recognized it. Vreth waited. Vreth said nothing. She went to her chambers and closed the door. Nara listened to the audio logs alone. She sat in her chamber on the warship with the lights turned low and the stars outside the viewport, and no one to see her face while she listened to a human talk a dragon through a nightmare. Reed said Rin's name. Then he said, you are okay. You are not in the wreck anymore. You are here. You are safe. I have got you. Then he kept talking. He did not tell Rin to be quiet. He did not express frustration at the hour or the noise. He simply stayed in the room and kept his voice at the same low, even level, and talked about nothing specific, nothing important, just the sound of a voice that knew what it was doing and was not going to stop doing it. The sounds from Rin changed. Then they slowed. Then they stopped. Reed's voice came once more at the end, quiet enough that the recording barely caught it. He said, there you go? Good. That was all. The log ended. Nara sat with that for a while. She was not a person who sat with things for long. She had spent 4,000 years making decisions quickly and well and moving on to the next one. But she sat with this. Hale was the oldest crew member by a wide margin, and the only non-human besides Reed who had been present consistently from the first night. Nara wanted a second account from someone who had no particular reason to protect Reed and who would tell her what she had seen plainly. Hale told her everything. She was organized and precise and without decoration. She described the first night in the lab, Reed on the floor until dawn with the hatchling against his chest. She described the feeding adjustments and the failed attempts and what finally worked. She described each combustion episode in sequence, when it happened, how Reed responded, what the outcome was. Hale paused there. Then she told Nara about the night before the warship arrived. Reed at his desk at 2 in the morning, writing the care document. What he had said when Hale asked him what he wanted Nara to know on his behalf. She repeated it clearly. Tell her he does not like to eat alone. Make sure she knows that. Hale said this, and then stopped talking and waited. Nara dismissed her. She went to the station's observation lounge and stood at the window alone for a while. The stars outside were the same stars she had looked at for 4 millennia. They had never had anything particular to tell her. She looked at them anyway. Reed had performed this act. 40 minutes, with burns on his arms, keeping his voice steady so Rin would not see him break. He had done it without knowing the word existed, without knowing it was sacred, without knowing that civilizations had written it on walls before they knew how to write anything else. He had simply done it because it was what the moment required. Nara thought about her own lost clutches. 3 of them. 3 times she had performed the grief rituals correctly and moved forward because she was the queen and the empire did not pause. She had not thought about them in a long time. She thought about them now, standing at the window, with no one watching her face. She stayed at the window until she was ready. Then she went back to Rin's room. Reed was there. Rin was awake and in motion around the space with the restless energy of a juvenile who was still determining where his edges were. He knocked a shelf bracket loose with his tail while Nara was watching and appeared not to notice. Nara told Reed she was not taking Rin immediately. Reed asked, how much time? She said she did not know yet. While they were speaking, Rin crossed the room, reached up, and began chewing on a structural fitting near the wall junction. Reed did not look up from Nara. He said, Rin, off the wall. Rin got off the wall. Nara looked at this. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, does he always listen to you? Reed said not always, but he had been better this week. She paused. She said, you are the first person outside the Dree to receive it. She said it quietly. She did not make it into ceremony. She said it the way someone states something that has been true for some time, and they have only now found the right words for it. Reed said thank you. He said it quietly and without performance. Rin, who had grown bored with the atmosphere of the room, crossed the space and attempted to climb into Reed's lap. At his current size, this was not something that worked in any practical sense, but Rin did not concern himself with practical considerations when he wanted to be close. He arranged most of himself across Reed anyway and settled. It made it physically impossible for Reed to stand up. He did not try. He put his hand on Rin's back and stayed where he was. Nara watched this for a moment. Then she left them to it, and Vreth followed her out, and neither of them spoke until they were back on the warship and the docking seal had closed behind them. Nara said, I know. The paperwork alone was extraordinary, not because of how long it was, though it was long, but because the Dree scribes tasked with writing it had to search 8 dynasties of imperial records and come back empty-handed. There was no prior document to base it on, no template, no precedent anywhere in 12,000 years of Dree legal history for what Queen Nara was asking them to write. Formal guardianship of a Dree hatchling under imperial law, granted to a human. They wrote it anyway. When Nara gave a direction, the absence of precedent was not a reason to pause. It was a reason to write faster. The political noise inside the Dree court lasted about a week. Several senior advisors raised concerns through proper channels. Vreth listened to all of them on Nara's behalf, because Nara had moved forward to the next problem and did not attend meetings whose conclusions were already settled. The concerns were acknowledged. The arrangement stood. The new station took 11 weeks to build, which was 7 months faster than the Concord Science Authority's projected timeline. This was because Nara's office did not wait for committee approvals, and the Concord Science Authority, Once it understood that the Dree Imperial fleet was moving materials into the sector regardless of what they decided, found ways to be helpful quite quickly. The station was jointly administered, larger than Duvan 9, and designed from the start with one large, warm, heat-resistant room at its center. Commander Orin was reassigned before the new station opened. His replacement posting had better food, a longer sleep cycle, and no fire-capable residents. On his last day at Duvan 9, he sent Reed a message that said, "I knew from the moment you came back with that egg. Take care of him." Reed read it twice and saved it. Dr. Hale Suvith transferred to the new station as the Dree Empire's official observer, a title Nara created for her specifically. Hale accepted without visible emotion, which for Hale was equivalent to visible delight. She began a formal research study on cross-species imprint bonding within her first week, intending to spend decades on it. She did not announce this ambition. She simply started taking notes. Technician Russ came because he had nowhere particular to be, and because by this point Rin had started deliberately seeking him out in the corridors, and the experience of being sought out by something that large, and that certain of itself, had done something to Russ that he was not entirely able to explain. He was there on the first day the new station opened, and he was the one Rin knocked over in greeting, gently by Rin's standards, which still left Russ sitting on the floor looking at the ceiling for a moment. Rin grew. He was also learning standard. His first full sentence in it arrived at month 4. Reed was eating dinner alone at the small table in the station kitchen, working through some survey data on his tablet, and Rin came through the door and stopped and looked at him. He said, in standard that sounded like it was being produced by a very patient geological event, "You are eating alone." Reed looked up from his tablet. Rin sat down on the floor next to him. Reed moved his tray to the center of the table. Rin could not use the table in any practical sense, but he was present, and that was the point. They stayed like that until the food was finished. The Concord Press session happened 6 months after the arrangement became official. A journalist was granted one question with Queen Nara following a trade summit. She asked why Nara had extended Dree Imperial legal recognition to a human. What, specifically, qualified Reed Calloway for the veiled title and formal guardianship of a Dree hatchling? Nara took her time before answering. The journalist asked which kind she meant. The quote ran on every Concord wire service within hours. Alya showed it to Reed on her tablet the next morning while he was eating breakfast. He read it once. He said nothing. He went back to his food. Alya said his response was deeply unsatisfying. Reed said he was not sure what she wanted him to say. He honestly was not. 1 year to the day after he drove a surface crawler out to a dead mining corridor and came back with something small wrapped in his jacket, Reed was on the observation deck of the news station. It was late. Most of the crew was asleep. He had come out here with no particular task, which was something he allowed himself occasionally, a few minutes in a place without anything immediately needing to be done. He heard the landing before he saw it, a sound like a large wind arriving very fast from above, and then the deck shook once, briefly, as something considerable touched down behind him. Reed turned around. He looked at Reed. Reed looked at him. Rin had been practicing standard with Hale for weeks. He had been practicing a specific thing, specifically, because he understood that languages carried weight, and he wanted the weight of this one to be right. He had learned which words, in Reed's language, carried the most. He said, slowly and clearly, each word placed with care, "Father who stays." Reed did not answer immediately. The stars were where they always were. The station was quiet around them. Everything that had happened in the year between that first night in the lab and this moment sat in the space between them without needing to be named. Reed said, "Yeah." He leaned his head against Reed's shoulder. His head weighed more than Reed did. Reed did not move. He did not shift his weight or adjust his stance or make any indication that this was unusual or difficult. He simply stood there with his hand against the warm scale of Rin's jaw and looked out at the same stars he had been looking at for a year. He stayed.